The night shift at St. Gabriel Trauma Center never truly slept. Even when the corridors looked empty, the hospital hummed, machines breathing in place of lungs, monitors ticking like distant clocks, footsteps echoing in polished silence. It was a world where urgency hid beneath routine, and where the smallest delay could mean the difference between life and loss. Naomi Carter moved through it like she belonged to the rhythm itself. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply arrived where she needed to be, always a moment before anyone realized she was needed. In Bay 3, she adjusted a patient's oxygen mask before the saturation alarm could even flicker. In Bay 6, she replaced a nearly empty IV bag without being asked. In Bay 1, she paused, watching a monitor, not because it was alarming, but because something about the patient's breathing pattern didn't feel right. And she was right. 30 seconds later, the attending physician noticed the same change. But by then, Naomi had already documented it. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever did. Because Naomi Carter wasn't the kind of nurse people talked about. She was the kind they overlooked. Carter. The voice came sharp and impatient. Dr. Victor Langford stood at the nurse's station, flipping through a chart with visible irritation. He was known across the hospital, brilliant, experienced, and impossible to please. "I need the full intake notes for the trauma patient in Bay 9, he said without looking up. "Not the summary, the original report." Naomi didn't turn immediately. She finished entering vitals into the system, closed the file, and then looked at him. "They're already on your desk," she said calmly. He paused, slowly looked up. "I didn't ask you to prepare them." "You were going to," she replied. There was no edge in her voice, no challenge. Just certainty. For a brief second, the air between them shifted. Then Langford scoffed lightly and walked off, muttering something under his breath. Beside Naomi, a younger nurse named Emily leaned closer. "You know he hates that, right?" she whispered. Naomi picked up another chart. "It doesn't affect the patient," she said. And that was the end of it. That was always the end of it. Naomi never argued. Never explained. Never tried to prove anything. She simply did the work. And she did it better than most. Dr. Allison Brooks had noticed. She hadn't said anything yet, but she had noticed. In 3 weeks, she had watched Naomi catch mistakes that experienced residents missed. She had seen her anticipate complications before they showed on scans. She had seen her read injuries, not just clinically, but instinctively. Like someone who had seen them before. Somewhere else. Somehow. It didn't add up. And Allison Brooks was not the kind of person who ignored things that didn't add up. At 11:42 p.m. the call came in. 2 incoming traumas, 1 critical. The tone of the dispatcher's voice changed on the last word. That alone was enough to shift the energy of the entire floor. Naomi looked up immediately. Something was different. She couldn't explain it. But she felt it. "Second patient," the radio continued, "male, early 30s, severe trauma, military escort present, ETA 3 minutes. Military escort. That was unusual. Very unusual. The trauma team moved fast. Gloves on. Stations ready. Equipment checked. Dr. Langford stepped into position, already issuing orders. Naomi moved toward the entrance doors. And waited. The ambulance arrived with a sharp hiss of brakes. The doors burst open. And they wheeled him in. He was unconscious. Pale. Covered in blood. But even through the chaos, Naomi noticed something immediately. His posture. His build. The way his body carried tension, even unconscious. This wasn't just any patient. This was someone trained. Disciplined. Conditioned. And the injuries. They didn't match the report. Blunt trauma, the paramedic began quickly. Possible internal bleeding, shoulder wound. Naomi wasn't listening. She was looking. Analyzing. Mapping. The angle of the shoulder injury. The depth of the cuts. The pattern of bruising. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Something wasn't right. They transferred him onto the table. The team moved in. Machines connected. Lines inserted. Voices overlapping. Controlled chaos. Pressure dropping, one resident called out. Internal bleed, Langford said. Prep for ultrasound. Naomi stepped closer. Watching. Calculating. Then she spoke. Check the right side. Langford didn't look at her. We are, he snapped. No, she said calmly. Lower subhepatic region. Silence. For half a second. Then, stay in your role, Carter, Langford said sharply. Let the team handle diagnosis. Naomi didn't respond. But she didn't move away either. She kept watching. The monitor beeped faster. The patient's condition worsened. The ultrasound didn't show enough. Something was missing. And Naomi knew it. She stepped forward, placed her hand lightly against the patient's abdomen. Right side. Lower quadrant. Then she spoke, clear, steady, impossible to ignore. You're missing the bleed. It's deeper. If you don't pack here, he's not making it through the next minute. The room froze. Every eye turned toward her. Langford slowly looked up. And for the first time, he hesitated. Then Dr. Brooks spoke. Do it. Everything moved again. Fast. Precise. Focused. They followed Naomi's direction. And within seconds, they found it. Exactly where she said. The bleeding was controlled. The pressure stabilized. The room exhaled. But no one said anything. Not yet. Because something had just happened. Something they didn't fully understand. 40 minutes later, the surgery was stabilizing. The patient remained unconscious. Sedated. Still. Until his eyes opened. It shouldn't have been possible. Not with the level of sedation. Not with his condition. But it happened. His gaze was unfocused at first. Drifting. Searching. Moving past faces. Past lights. Past noise. Then, it stopped. On Naomi. Everything in the room seemed to quiet. Just for a moment. His lips moved. Barely. But enough. Commander. The word landed like a shockwave. Naomi didn't react. Not outwardly. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't change. But for one single second. She stopped moving. Then she resumed. Calm. Controlled. Professional. He's disoriented, she said. Sedation effect. Langford nodded quickly. Yes, normal response, continue. The room accepted it. Because it was easier. But Dr. Brooks didn't. She had seen it. That 1 second. That pause. And she knew. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't random. That meant something. Something important. Hours later, the patient was moved to ICU. The fluid returned to normal. Or at least, what passed for normal. But nothing was actually the same. Naomi stood alone at the sink, washing her hands. Slowly, methodically, like she always did. Behind her, Dr. Brooks stepped closer. You knew where the bleed was, she said quietly. Naomi didn't look up. I observed. Brooks shook her head slightly. No, she said, you recognized it. Silence. Then Brooks added softly. And he recognized you. Naomi turned off the water, dried her hands, and finally looked at her. Focus on the patient, she said. Then she walked away. But behind her calm expression, something had already changed. Because the past she had buried had just spoken her name. And it wasn't finished. The hospital never truly slowed down, but by early morning, a different kind of quiet settled over the trauma floor. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of systems running on habit while minds tried to catch up. Naomi Carter sat at the nurse's station with a patient file open in front of her, but her eyes weren't reading the words. They were fixed on a single thought that had pushed everything else aside. Commander. The word had been quiet, barely audible, but it had carried a weight that could not be ignored. It had not been confusion. It had not been coincidence. It had been recognition. And recognition in her world always came with consequences. Naomi adjusted her glasses slightly and forced herself to focus on the screen. Vitals, medication logs, routine entries, the things that made up her current life. The life she had built carefully, deliberately, one shift at a time. A life where nobody asked questions and she never offered answers. A life where she was simply a nurse, efficient, capable, invisible. But now that life had a fracture in it. And it was spreading. Across the station, two nurses were already whispering. They weren't subtle about it. They didn't think they needed to be. To them, Naomi was background noise, someone who existed on the edge of their attention. That made it easier to talk freely when they thought she wasn't listening. "Did you hear what he said?" one of them murmured. "He called her something like commander or something like that." "Probably just delirium," the other replied. "Patients say weird things all the time." Still, the way he looked at her. Naomi closed the file with a soft click. The whispers stopped immediately. She stood, straightened her posture, and walked away without acknowledging them. She didn't need to. Their uncertainty was already enough. At the far end of the hallway, a large window overlooked the city. The early morning light was pale and cold, stretching across rooftops and empty streets. Naomi stood there for a moment, arms loosely crossed, staring out without really seeing anything. 7 years. 7 years since she had heard that word spoken to her with meaning. 7 years since she had chosen to walk away from everything it represented. 7 years of silence. And now, in a single moment, it had all come back. She closed her eyes briefly, and for just a second she allowed herself to remember. Not everything, just enough. The sound of boots on gravel, the sharp clarity of commands given and followed without hesitation, the unspoken trust between people who knew that their lives depended on each other, the weight of responsibility that didn't allow room for doubt. And the faces. Always the faces. She opened her eyes again quickly, cutting the memory off before it could go further. That was not a place she allowed herself to go anymore. "Naomi." The voice behind her was calm, steady, and deliberate. "Dr. Allison Brooks." Naomi didn't turn immediately. She already knew what this was about. "You've been looking at that window for 3 minutes," Brooks said as she stepped closer. "That's not something you do unless you're thinking about something you don't want to be thinking about." Naomi exhaled quietly and turned to face her. "I'm on break," she said simply. Brooks studied her for a moment, not with suspicion, but with careful attention. "The patient in ICU," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "The one from last night. His name is Lieutenant Marcus Hale." The name hit Naomi harder than she expected. Not because she recognized it immediately, but because of the way Brooks said it. Measured, intentional. "Important. I assume that means something to you," Brooks added. Naomi's expression didn't change, but her silence was enough. Brooks nodded slightly, as if confirming a theory. "His file is restricted," she continued. "More restricted than anything I've seen come through this hospital. There are entire sections missing, and the sections that are there don't line up with the injuries he presented with." Naomi met her gaze. "Then you should follow protocol and let the military handle it." "That's what I was told," Brooks replied. "But I don't like being told to stop asking questions when the answers don't make sense." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Brooks added quietly, "He didn't just recognize you, he trusted you." That landed differently. Naomi looked away briefly, back toward the window, before returning her attention to Brooks. "Patients in trauma sometimes attach meaning to familiar faces," she said. "It's not unusual." Brooks tilted her head slightly. "You don't believe that?" Naomi didn't respond. Because she couldn't. And Brooks knew it. "Whatever you were before you came here," Brooks said, her voice softer now, "it's not gone. You don't just forget how to read injuries like that. You don't just know things you shouldn't know. Naomi held her gaze for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Some things are better left where they are." Brooks didn't push further, but she didn't let it go either. "I'm not asking you to explain everything," she said. "I'm just asking you to understand that if something is wrong here, really wrong, then ignoring it won't make it go away." Naomi's jaw tightened slightly, because that was the one thing she knew better than anyone. Ignoring it never made it go away. The ICU was quieter than the trauma floor, but the tension there felt heavier. Two uniformed personnel stood outside the restricted room, their posture rigid, their attention sharp. They weren't hospital security. They didn't blend into the environment. They stood out in a way that made people instinctively keep their distance. Naomi approached them with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything. "I'm here to check on the patient," she said, holding up her ID. One of the guards looked at it briefly, then at her. There was a moment of evaluation, of assessment. Then he stepped aside. "5 minutes," he said. Naomi nodded once and entered the room. Marcus Hale lay motionless in the bed, monitors surrounding him, each one marking the fragile stability they had managed to achieve. Up close, he looked younger than she had initially thought. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, strong features even under the strain of injury. But it was his stillness that stood out. Not the stillness of sleep. The stillness of someone who knew how to conserve energy. Who knew how to wait. Naomi moved closer, checking the monitors, adjusting a line, making small, necessary corrections. Her hands were steady, precise, practiced. Professional. And yet, she could feel it. That pull. That recognition. "Lieutenant Hale," she said quietly, "if you can hear me, you're stable. The surgery was successful." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, his fingers twitched. Just slightly. Naomi stilled. Watched. Waited. His breathing changed first, subtle but different, more controlled, more intentional. Then his eyes opened. This time, there was no confusion. No searching. No delay. He looked directly at her. And he knew exactly who she was. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rough but clear. Naomi didn't react outwardly, but something inside her shifted. "I work here," she replied evenly. His gaze didn't waver. "That's not what I meant." The silence between them stretched. Heavy. Full. "You were declared inactive," he continued quietly. "Off the grid, no operational footprint." Naomi's expression remained calm, but her voice dropped slightly. "You're recovering from major surgery. You shouldn't be talking." He ignored that completely. "They told us you were gone," he said. "They were right," she replied. Another pause. Then more quietly he said, "We needed you." That one sentence carried more weight than anything else he had said. Naomi felt it. But she didn't let it show. "You have a team," she said. "Focus on getting back to them." Marcus studied her face carefully, as if searching for something. Then he said, "Not anymore." That changed everything. Naomi's eyes sharpened slightly. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to answer. Because he was choosing his words carefully. "We were tracking something," he said. "Something big, internal, not outside threats, inside." Naomi's mind was already moving, already connecting pieces she didn't want to connect. "Go on," she said. His voice dropped further. "Someone knew our movements. Every time we got close, they were ahead of us, not by chance, by design." A familiar cold feeling settled in Naomi's chest. She had felt it before. Years ago. "We were compromised," he continued, "and the deeper we looked, the worse it got." Naomi leaned slightly closer. "How high does it go?" she asked. Marcus held her gaze. "Higher than it should." That was enough. More than enough. Before she could ask anything else, the monitor beeped slightly, signaling a shift in his condition. Naomi stepped back into her professional role immediately, adjusting settings, checking readings. "You need rest," she said firmly. "There isn't time," he replied. There is, she said with quiet authority, because if you don't recover, you won't be able to do anything. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't, because he recognized that tone, that authority. Even now, "Commander," he said again, softer this time. Naomi's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she finished what she was doing and stepped back. "I'm not your commander anymore," she said. But her voice didn't fully believe it. Outside the room, the guards remained in place, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside. Naomi walked past them without a word, her steps steady, her expression unchanged. But inside, everything had changed. Because this wasn't just about one patient. This wasn't just about one moment. This was something bigger, something familiar, something she had walked away from once before, and something that, whether she wanted it or not, was pulling her back in. By mid-afternoon, the hospital no longer felt like a hospital to Naomi Carter. The same corridors were there, the same routines, the same steady rhythm of controlled urgency, but beneath it all, something had shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years reading environments where danger didn't announce itself. The air felt tighter. The movements of people felt slightly off. Conversations stopped a fraction too quickly when she approached. And most telling of all, there were faces she did not recognize. Faces that didn't belong to the natural ecosystem of a trauma center. Naomi stood at the medication station, reviewing a dosage chart, but her attention was divided. Every reflection in the glass panels, every footstep behind her, every change in tone across the ward registered somewhere in her awareness. She wasn't looking for something specific. She was waiting for confirmation. In her experience, when something felt wrong, it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when it revealed itself. That moment came sooner than expected. At the far end of the corridor, two men in plain clothes walked in with the kind of confidence that didn't come from familiarity with the hospital. Their posture was wrong for visitors, wrong for administrators, wrong even for law enforcement. They moved like trained personnel, controlled, observant, scanning without appearing to scan. Naomi's eyes flicked to them for less than a second before returning to her chart, but it was enough. She had already assessed their gait, their spacing, their awareness of exits. They weren't here by chance. She closed the chart slowly and stepped away from the station, moving toward the ICU corridor with measured calm. As she walked, she passed Dr. Brooks, who was speaking with a resident near the entrance. Brooks caught Naomi's eye, and in that brief moment of silent communication, something passed between them, an understanding that required no explanation. Brooks finished her sentence mid-thought and turned slightly, watching the two men as they continued down the hall. "They're not family," Brooks said under her breath as Naomi approached. "No," Naomi replied quietly, "they're not." Brooks folded her arms, her expression tightening. "Do you think they're here for him?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched as the two men slowed near the ICU checkpoint, speaking briefly with the guard stationed there. The guard's posture shifted, more rigid, more cautious. That was enough. "Yes," Naomi said finally, "and they're not the last." Brooks exhaled slowly, processing that. "Then we have a problem." Naomi's gaze remained steady. "We've had one since last night. We're just seeing it clearly now." Inside the ICU room, Marcus Hale was awake again, though barely. The sedation had worn off enough for him to maintain awareness, but not enough to mask the strain his body was under. When Naomi entered, he turned his head slightly, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "They're here," he said immediately, his voice low. Naomi moved to his bedside, checking the monitor with practiced efficiency. "I know," she replied. His jaw tightened. "Then we don't have time." "We have enough," she said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. "Tell me everything you didn't say earlier." Marcus studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to trust, but then something in his expression settled. He had already made that decision. "We were tracking a weapons diversion network," he said quietly. "Not external supply lines, internal distribution, military-grade equipment being rerouted before it ever reached official deployment." Naomi's hands paused briefly on the monitor controls. "Inside the system," she said. "Yes," he confirmed. "At first we thought it was small, a few bad actors exploiting gaps, but the deeper we went, the cleaner it looked, too clean. That's when we realized it wasn't a leak, it was organized." Naomi's mind was already mapping the implications, connecting patterns she hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years. "How high?" she asked again. Marcus met her gaze, command level. The room felt smaller suddenly. Naomi leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Names." He hesitated, not out of fear, but because of what it meant to say them aloud. "We didn't get a full list," he said, "but we got one, the one that matters." Naomi's expression remained controlled, but inside something tightened. "Say it." Marcus's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Admiral Robert Hayes." For a moment, everything went silent. Not in the room, not in the hospital. Inside Naomi. Because that name wasn't just another name. It was a connection to something she had buried. Something she had blamed herself for. Something that had never made sense until now. She stepped back slightly, her thoughts moving fast, precise, assembling a picture that had been incomplete for 7 years. The mission, the failure, the intelligence that had been too perfect, the ambush that had come too quickly, the way everything had collapsed in a way that had felt orchestrated. And now, it had a name. "You're certain?" she asked. Marcus nodded once. "We found authorization patterns, communication traces, it all pointed back to him. We were building the case when we got hit." Naomi's gaze hardened slightly, and the data. His expression shifted, frustration mixing with something heavier. "Lost during extraction," he said. "At least that's what they think." Naomi's eyes sharpened. "What does that mean?" Marcus took a slow breath. "My teammate secured it before we went down. He knew what it was. He knew what would happen if it got out. He didn't carry it out with him." Naomi understood immediately. He hid it. Marcus nodded, and if it's still there, it's everything. The weight of that settled heavily in the room. Evidence. Proof. Not speculation, not theory. Something that could expose everything. Naomi turned slightly, looking toward the door, toward the guards, toward the hallway beyond. The situation had just changed from dangerous to critical. "They're not here to protect you," she said quietly. Marcus gave a faint, humorless smile. "I figured that out when they tried to kill me." Naomi didn't react to the bluntness of it. She simply nodded once. Then she made a decision. A real one. Not as a nurse. Not as someone observing from the sidelines. But as someone who had once been responsible for lives far beyond her own. "We're moving you," she said. Marcus's eyes locked onto hers. "Out of the hospital." "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "That's not going to be easy." Naomi's expression didn't change. "It doesn't need to be easy, it needs to work." Before he could respond, the door opened slightly. Dr. Brooks stepped in, closing it quietly behind her. "They're asking questions," Brooks said without preamble. "Not directly, but enough to know they're trying to establish control." Naomi nodded. "Then we move before they finish." Brooks looked at Marcus, then back at Naomi. "You're serious?" "Yes." There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Brooks studied her for a moment, then gave a small, decisive nod. "Then tell me what you need." That was the moment everything shifted. Not just for Naomi. For all of them. Because this was no longer about observation. It was about action. Naomi stepped slightly away from the bed, her posture changing almost imperceptibly, but enough. The calm, quiet nurse was still there, but something else had surfaced beneath it. Something structured, disciplined, focused. She spoke clearly, efficiently. "We need a transfer that doesn't exist on record, a route that avoids primary corridors, equipment that won't trigger inventory flags, and we need it done within the next 2 hours." Brooks listened without interrupting, already thinking ahead. "I can handle the paperwork," she said. "I'll create a dummy transfer order, something routine enough not to raise attention." Naomi nodded. "Good, we'll use the service corridor on the east side, fewer cameras, less traffic." Marcus watched them both, his expression shifting from concern to something else, something closer to recognition. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Naomi didn't look at him. "Yes." Brooks glanced between them, then back at Naomi. "What about security?" Naomi's gaze hardened slightly. "We assume it's compromised." That answer said everything. For a brief moment, silence filled the room again. Then Brooks straightened slightly. "All right," she said. "Then we don't assume anything works in our favor, we make our own." Naomi met her eyes. And for the first time, there was trust there. Not built over years. Built in a moment. The kind that mattered. Outside, the hospital continued as if nothing had changed. Patients were treated. Charts were updated. Machines continued their steady rhythm. But beneath it all, a different operation had begun. One that didn't appear in any system. One that didn't follow any protocol. One that relied on something far more dangerous than procedure. It relied on people who had chosen not to look away. And for Naomi Carter, it meant stepping back into a role she had sworn she would never return to. Not because she wanted to, but because some things, once uncovered, could not be ignored. The hospital clock read 11:08 p.m. when the plan moved from theory into motion. The building had settled into that late-night state where activity never stopped, but attention thinned just enough for small things to slip through unnoticed. It was the exact kind of environment Naomi Carter understood better than anyone, because she had spent years operating in spaces where success depended not on force, but on timing, precision, and the ability to move without becoming the center of attention. Marcus Hale lay on the transport gurney, his condition stabilized but far from strong. The bandaging along his shoulder and torso held, the monitors showed a fragile but steady rhythm, and his breathing remained controlled through sheer discipline rather than comfort. Naomi stood at his side, adjusting the portable line one last time, her hands steady, her movements efficient. To anyone watching, she was simply a nurse preparing a patient for transfer. But inside, every second was being measured, every step already mapped in advance. Dr. Allison Brooks stood just outside the ICU station, engaged in what appeared to be a detailed and time-consuming handoff discussion with the incoming shift. Her voice carried just enough authority to prevent interruption, and just enough complexity to delay anyone from rushing her. She had turned routine into a shield, and she was holding it firmly in place. In the hallway beyond, the two unfamiliar men who had arrived earlier were no longer standing still. They had repositioned themselves closer to the ICU corridor, their casual posture now replaced with quiet intent. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Men like that never did. They believed control was already theirs, and that belief was exactly what Naomi was counting on. At precisely 11:12 p.m., she gave a small nod to the orderly standing at the far end of the corridor. He wasn't really an orderly, of course. He was one of the trusted personnel Marcus had hinted at earlier, someone who knew how to move, how to watch, and how to act without hesitation. He responded with the slightest shift of posture, then turned and walked down the service hallway, clearing the path ahead. Naomi placed her hands on the gurney and began to move. The wheels rolled forward with a soft, steady rhythm against the polished floor. Marcus kept his eyes half closed, his breathing even, his body still. He looked like any other patient being transferred between departments, and that illusion was their greatest protection. They moved past the ICU checkpoint without resistance. The guard glanced at the paperwork Brooks had prepared and waved them through without a second look. That alone bought them precious minutes. But as they entered the East Service corridor, Naomi felt it, the shift. The kind that didn't come from sound. The kind that came from instinct. She didn't turn immediately, she didn't break stride, but her awareness sharpened, expanding outward, reading the space behind her. Footsteps. Not hurried. Not loud. But deliberate. Someone had noticed. "Keep moving," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man beside her adjusted his grip on the gurney, his posture tightening just enough to signal readiness without drawing attention. Behind them, the footsteps closed the distance. Then a voice. "Excuse me." It was calm, controlled, but it wasn't a request. Naomi slowed just slightly, then turned her head with measured composure. One of the men from earlier stood a few feet away, his expression neutral, his eyes anything but. "Where is this patient being transferred?" he asked. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Step-down monitoring," she replied. "Orders were updated 10 minutes ago." He studied her, then the paperwork, then the patient. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Then, Marcus shifted. Just slightly, but enough. The man's eyes narrowed. And Naomi knew. The moment had passed. They had been made. Now, she said quietly. Everything moved at once. The orderly at the front pushed forward hard, accelerating the gurney down the corridor. Naomi stayed beside Marcus, stabilizing the equipment as they picked up speed. Behind them, voices rose, sharper now, no longer pretending to be calm. Stop them! But they were already moving too fast. The corridor stretched ahead, long and narrow, the exit door visible at the far end. Every second mattered now, every step had to count. Naomi's focus narrowed completely. There was no fear, no hesitation, just execution. Left side pressure dropping, Marcus said through clenched teeth. Naomi adjusted the line immediately, her hands working without thought. Stay with me, she said. We're almost there. The exit door burst open as they reached it, the cold night air rushing in like a shock to the system. Outside, a transport van waited exactly where it was supposed to be, its rear doors already open. They didn't slow down. They lifted Marcus into the van with practiced coordination, securing him in place as Naomi climbed in beside him. The doors slammed shut just as two figures emerged from the corridor behind them. The engine roared to life, and the van pulled away. For the first time since the night had begun, there was distance between them and the threat. But Naomi knew better than to believe that meant safety. They'll track us, Marcus said, his voice strained but steady. I know, she replied. They won't stop. I know. There was no panic in her voice, no uncertainty. Only clarity. Because this wasn't new. It was familiar. Painfully familiar. The difference was, this time she wasn't walking away. The city lights blurred past the windows as the van moved through side streets, avoiding main roads, changing direction often enough to break patterns. Naomi kept her attention on Marcus, monitoring his condition, adjusting as needed, keeping him stable through sheer focus and control. You should have stayed out of this, he said quietly after a moment. Naomi didn't look at him. I tried, she replied. He gave a faint, tired smile. Didn't seem like your style. She almost smiled back. Almost. They reached the safe location just after midnight, a small, unremarkable facility on the edge of the city, the kind of place that didn't attract attention because there was nothing about it worth noticing. Inside, the space had already been prepared. Equipment was in place. Supplies were ready. Everything had been arranged with quiet efficiency. Naomi moved Marcus onto the bed, securing his lines, checking his vitals, making the adjustments that would keep him stable through the next phase. Only when she was certain he would hold did she step back. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. You could have left, Marcus said from the bed, watching her carefully. Nobody would have blamed you. Naomi stood still for a moment, then turned slightly toward him. They already did, she said. There was no bitterness in her voice. No anger. Just truth. The room fell quiet. Then Marcus spoke again, more softly this time. They were wrong. Naomi didn't respond immediately. Because that wasn't something she needed to hear. Not anymore. Morning came slowly. And with it, the consequences. By sunrise, the information Marcus had carried was no longer hidden. The evidence had been secured, verified, and transmitted through channels that could not be quietly erased. What had been buried for years was now exposed, and once exposed, it moved quickly. Investigations began. Statements were issued. Questions were asked in rooms where silence had once been enough. And for the first time, the truth had weight. Back at the hospital, the story spread faster than anyone could contain it. Not the full story, not all the details, but enough. Enough for people to start looking at Naomi Carter differently. Enough for whispers to turn into conversations. Enough for understanding to begin replacing assumption. Dr. Langford watched it unfold from the edge of the trauma floor, his usual certainty replaced with something quieter. Reflection, perhaps, recognition. The realization that he had stood in the presence of something he had never bothered to see. When Naomi returned 2 days later, she did so the same way she always had, walking through the main entrance, her bag over one shoulder, her expression calm, her focus already on the work ahead. But the way the room responded was different. Conversations paused. Eyes followed, not with curiosity, with respect. She moved through it without acknowledgement, just as she always had, because nothing about her had changed. She was still the same person, still the same nurse, still the same quiet presence who did the work without asking for recognition, until she reached the center of the floor and stopped because someone was standing there, waiting. Marcus Hale, dressed now in civilian clothes, his posture stronger, his presence unmistakable. He stood straight, and in front of everyone, he raised his hand in a formal salute. The entire floor went still. Every voice, every movement, every sound paused. Naomi looked at him, then at the room around her, at the people who had overlooked her, dismissed her, misjudged her. Then she returned the salute. Calm, precise, unshaken. And in that moment, everything changed. Not because she needed recognition, not because she had something to prove, but because the truth had finally been seen. Naomi lowered her hand, looked at Marcus. "How's the recovery?" she asked. He smiled slightly. "Good enough." She nodded once, then turned and went back to work, because that was who she had always been. Not defined by titles, not changed by recognition, not shaped by what others chose to see or ignore. She had never been just a nurse. They had just never been looking closely enough.